Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 14 of TCE Talks. So, I should probably start off by explaining that I have not done a part 5 for the Super Chops series because I did as I said. I sat down and I reread the book a few times and basically just came to the conclusion that I didn't have anything insightful to add. So the funny thing is, I kept finding when I would look for quotes that I really liked that that there's a little bit of repetition in the book. There's there are things in there that are written in multiple ways, but generally speaking, I think that in terms of covering the basic principles of what Super Chops is / was, how it works and how how we can use it to improve our playing, I had basically all of those bases covered. It's probably also worth noting that no, I was going to say obviously it might not be obvious. Obviously, the content of that book plays a very strong role in my understanding of how brass playing embouchures work. And so anything that I discuss on this channel, whether it be specifically relating to trumpet yoga, Super Chops, or TCE, it all is part of this same course that the pedagogy of Jerome Calit followed through its evolution over time. So, any issues that may or may not have been discussed in those videos will come up in future, and and hopefully everything was sort of tied up quite nicely. I haven't really had many questions pertaining to the stuff that I said, so I think that we can afford to move on. Okay, so today's episode, I'm just going to be briefly talking about a topic I've tried to approach before in written form, and that is the sound concept of trumpet. But this isn't so much to do with me telling you how a trumpet should sound and why, but it's me explaining some experiences that I've had, a question that I was asked in the comments from a previous video, that I intended getting this video out before they asked the question. But this is the order that things have happened in, so we'll just deal with it. And hopefully to sort of demonstrate using some basic knowledge of acoustics. Is that the best way to put it? Defining sound and how it works. We can sort of take this knowledge and hopefully reach some sensible conclusions about the approach that we should be taking when we try to define our concept of sound as a trumpet player or indeed any brass instrumentalist. Now, okay, so I'll start off with talking about my experience playing with the Bristol Opera Company, which now is over a month ago. I had a bit of a funny week. I had taken 5 days off from my day job in order to finish off an online course I was studying in the day, and then play the trumpet in the opera company in the evenings every night for the week. And when I was sat with the computer doing this course, I had my trumpet beside me, and I had 5 or 6 prototype mouthpieces. They were all prototypes that had been made and or designed with Michael Barclay, the guy who made this microphone. Excuse me, I've got an itchy nose. He's a professional trumpet player from Northern Ireland, and he works very closely with the guys at Venture Mouthpieces. He is a Venture artist. Although Venture make my mouthpieces too, I'm not a Venture artist, and that was a kind of a business decision. It's a conversation I didn't even pursue with Doug because I wanted to keep the Neoteric brand and have more control over everything. It's cost me, obviously it costs me money to work in this way, but it also means that I can make profit. So, swings and roundabouts. You work harder, you earn more money, I guess. So I'm sat there with these prototype Venture mouthpieces that Mike had made for classical trumpet playing, kind of fairly large cups, and they all had the same rim that Mike uses, which is based upon a Venture design. It's got quite a similar cup diameter to the Neoteric brass mouthpieces, though mine is very slightly smaller, and because of angles and shapes, it does result in quite a different feel on the lips. And so anyway, I was exploring the sounds that I could make with this mouthpiece and quite enjoying it, because although it's physically small, it was getting me quite close to a sound that I used to have many years ago, when there was quite a period of time when I was playing on a Vincent Bach 3C that I had opened the throat on myself with a set of files. It was very trial and error, kind of like no proper scientific experiments going on here. It was me going, I think it'd be better if I made this hole bigger, get more air through it, innit? And so I had this Bach 3C with probably like a 25 throat, let's say. And I used to play that with an old Ambassador trumpet. And a lot of the playing I was doing at that time was I was in a function band and I was in a ska band. And, this horn made a really nice sound. But if I was to try and use that equipment and try to make that sound these days, I don't think I could do it with TCE, because, I really used to I was young. I was in my mid-20s. I could put a ton of physical effort into playing without any real consequences. Maybe I had ringing ears and swollen chops, but it would all be fine by the next day, Whereas I think that, sensibly, if I was to carry on trying to play like that now, over time, my playing would definitely get worse. I'm not about, I think it's important that people understand that during that period of time, when I was playing in those bands and I was out doing it 4 or 5 nights a week, my range, literally the highest notes I could play on a trumpet, and more to the point, the highest notes I could play at a gig, was actually going down. So I had sort of come to the point when I was about, I think I said this before, when I was about 18 years old, I could play a G above high C by using lots of pressure and blowing really hard. And, I'd maintained that throughout college because I was playing a lot. And then during these years, over about a 5 or more year period, my range was getting less and less. Although I could play a G at home softly in a room, when I was on stage, because I hadn't been taught any of the things that I will eventually talk about in this video, my range and stamina were getting worse. I could play a high D towards the middle of a gig. I know that we used to play "Let Me Entertain You" it was always the first song of a gig with the function band I was in at the time. And I could play the G in that solo, but often I would blow my chops out doing so. And then for the rest of the gig, I wouldn't have that kind of range, which is ridiculous. I'm not saying that not having that range is ridiculous. What is ridiculous is that I would blow out my chops playing the first tune of a gig and then spend the rest of the night pressing and blowing and, doing a physical workout just to try to keep the trumpet working. It's no way to go, and the longer you do it, the worse things get. So how did I get myself onto that? Yeah, I was just enjoying trying, making that sort of sound with this equipment. And I would go off to play in the opera, and I was, for the majority of the week, using my Neoteric Brass Legacy model mouthpiece. That's what it's designed for. I use it for chamber music, which literally means small orchestra or brass ensemble. It's fantastic for playing the D trumpet, which is what I've done with it this weekend. I was playing in a chamber orchestra yesterday, and it works great in piccolo trumpet. And then on the B flat trumpet, it's also, I use it in a chamber orchestra, but I've also used it for small group jazz stuff and recordings that I've made at home and all this sort of business. So it's basically intended as a bit of an all-rounder, but it's probably not what you'd want if you were playing in a trumpet section in a symphony orchestra, for example. You could use it for playing principal trumpet. But, that's something that when we talk about, sort of the frequency range that a trumpet is intended to exist within, it's still on the higher side when compared to more standard equipment like a 3C or a 1.5C or something like that. When I was playing with the Legacy mouthpiece in the opera, I found it really difficult to hear myself making, to know what sort of sound I was making is probably a good way of putting it. That music, we were playing La Traviata, and it was a reduced orchestration. I don't know who did the orchestration or why they chose to write for the trumpet in this way, but most of what I was playing was all middle register. There would be quite a lot of instances of long notes with crescendos, where you would be starting the note or almost creeping into the note with no real attack on the front. And trying to blend with two French horns. There was not another trumpet. There was no trombone. It was trumpet and two horns, and then 4 wind and string section, and a percussionist behind us with the timps and all pots and pans, all that business, what they do. And so it was a real challenge for me, and I was spending most of this time in my head thinking, if I had that bigger mouthpiece, if I had that, I'm going to use those words that I hate, that darker sound, then it would be easier for me to be doing the right job here. But I knew as well the facts that I'm about to present, which are what I'm hearing in that environment is not what the audience is hearing. I think the nearest audience member would have been about 20 meters away from me, which is about 60 feet. And then the furthest audience member would have been about 50 meters away, so maybe 150 feet. Just using basic and not all that incorrect, or not all that accurate maths. But now, so I had a hard wall to one side, which reflected the sound. There was I was playing into the back of a musician's chair who was about less than 2 meters in front of me. Literally, there was my trumpet, a music stand, and then the back of someone's head. And then to the side and behind me, there were thick, heavy sort of curtains the type that you get in a theatre. And, they soak up all the sound. They just deaden everything. And so what I was hearing was not the same sound that was being heard on stage and not the same sound that was being heard by the audience. And that brings me on to discuss this topic that, believe it or not, trumpets are acoustic instruments. And it seems mad to have to point that out, but a lot of the experience I have playing professionally is in bands where I'm the only one that isn't naturally amplified, or I should say not amplified by design. So obviously you've got the singer, they're going into a microphone. I'm not including them. But when you say, guitar, bass, keyboards, all of those go straight into an amp. And then, okay, fine, drum kit. But but that's a whole other beast. They're to a degree they're loud already. But also, any good sound person will take the sound of a drum kit, balance it with microphones so that it sounds good in the space, and then they bring the rest of the band up to match the kit. And so, when you start off playing in these more commercial sort of environments, you have to learn a lot about how to deal with this, how to deal with the fact that your very directional trumpet points all the sound away from you, and that all of the sound around you on stage is from loud amplified instruments, and you're really not going to hear yourself that well unless you have a sound back or unless you have good monitoring. Even then, you may be using earplugs, and there's a lot of playing by feel that goes on there. And also, if you're playing straight into a microphone, which is an inch or two away from the bell, there's literally no need for you to be really playing much over MF, or on the quieter side of forte, to allow for a bit of vibrancy in the sound, or a little bit of excitement to the tone. There's no need to be breaching these dynamics, because you are definitely louder than the singer, and they're probably the loudest person in the room. And so there's nothing that you can add by playing louder that isn't dealt with by the sound system. Now, when you're in this more acoustic situation like this opera, I don't really have the facilities of all of that equipment. I don't have the microphone, I don't have the sound man, I don't have the monitors, you can't really use a sound back in the same way. So a lot of it comes down to trusting that your instrument makes the appropriate sound. And I know from my own practice and from previous better acoustic situations that my trumpet with the legacy mouthpiece used with the TCE does make an appropriate characteristic trumpet sound as heard by the audience. Now, this is one of those things where I've talked in the past about how we will often sit in a practice room, which is about this size, and aim to make a sound that's pleasing in this room. I think that's one of the reasons that many people will gravitate towards large equipment, because in a room this size, having a softer sound can be likened to having a more pleasing tone, whereas in actual fact, you're just playing softer, or things like that. I think the thing that I really intended to discuss here is relating to something I mentioned in a podcast a while back, which was that the trumpet tone, like all sound, has shape. Simply put, lower pitched notes will emanate from your trumpet in a sphere. Well, all sound does, but basically they will be physically rounder and less focused, more spread. Let's put it like that. As you play higher in pitch, the notes tend to become more directional, more focused. Now, when we're considering that a trumpet tone is a composite of the fundamental frequency, that's the note itself, and then a series of overtones, i.e. tones that are higher in pitch than the fundamental frequency, all of those overtones are going to be more directional than the fundamental, because the higher you go, the more focused and directional the sound will be. A higher frequency pitch has more energy and therefore projects and travels further. So I want you to imagine a situation. Let's say that you're playing in an ensemble, and your audience is 50 or 100 meters away. All of those lower, nice warm tones that everyone strives to create on a brass instrument that sound wonderful in a small room like this, they will only occupy the space around you when compared to the overtones that also exist in the sound. What that means is that the sound the audience hears will probably be brighter than the sound you think you're creating. Now, I will use this explanation to justify to people using something like we're still sort of thinking in quite basic terms. So let's say we're talking about a Bach 7C when compared to a Bach 1.5C. Someone might say, oh, well, the 7C makes a brighter tone. They may say thinner tone because they don't have that broad, dark fundamental all around them. But the truth is that as far as the audience is concerned, what reaches them is the same. And what you may actually find is that the tone that reaches the audience from a 7C is going to be clearer than that reaches them from a larger, like 1.5 or 1C or something like that. This more tubby sound. This isn't something that's sort of like, I think I would hasten to add that there are some amazing professional orchestral musicians that have very successful execution of, playing with a broad yet bright and vibrant tone on this large equipment. But the point is that they are the anomalies. They are the people who've spent years, maybe decades, working on efficient execution of sound with an appropriate bright and broad tone on that large equipment. And one of the most classic examples is Bud Herseth. There's a video on YouTube of Bud playing in a brass ensemble. The camera's panning around, and you're listening to the music and you're thinking, God, that's a great piccolo trumpet sound. It's so focused, it's so clear, all the attacks are precise. Oh, it's wonderful. And then the camera comes a bit further around and there's Bud there sat with a C trumpet in C, and you think, how's that possible? This is a man who's renowned for playing on a Bach 1C, and he's playing a large trumpet and it sounds like a piccolo. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, is that quality trumpet sound is not about that fundamental. It's about the overtones. Obviously the fundamental will always be there. But that sound that gets out to the audience, the sound I wasn't hearing when I was in the opera orchestra, that made my job very difficult because I wanted to sit on top of the ensemble around me. The sound that the audience of any ensemble hears is mostly overtones, is a bright but broad sound. And so if you strive to make that sound all the time, then you're working with the physics of the trumpet, and it is a much easier thing for you to do. And I think that having this understanding, which is basically only one piece of information, and that is that sound has shape, and that higher pitched notes are more directional. That's all I'm telling you. Having this information enables you to make correct decisions in terms of choice of equipment. And that probably means that we could all do with playing on smaller mouthpieces. Because it's easier to play across the whole range of the instrument. I would hasten to add it's easier to play with a more even sound, and maybe I can just put something on the end here about what that means. The train of thought has left the station. It's easier to play for a long period of time when you're putting less effort into sound production, which is one of those things where, when you're talking about big versus small mouthpieces, it often feels like we can make the sound initiate easier with the larger mouthpiece, but you are using more air to activate more lip, which means that you need more muscle in the face in order to maintain the structural integrity of the embouchure, etc., etc. Okay, so let me just have a quick look through my notes. I think I've made most of the points. I just want to no, I think that's it. Actually, I was going to say I wanted to circle back and talk about an email that a comment thread that happened on the last video, but actually it's all been covered. It's all been covered here. I think it's worthwhile sort of thinking about all of this information in relation to other types of ensembles. So I've really been talking a lot about classical trumpet playing and playing music in a classical ensemble, but it also applies to a big band. It also applies to a marching band, which is what these comments were about. Now, when you're in a marching band, your audience is much further away than when you're in a small orchestra accompanying an opera in a theatre. You've got to imagine that your audience is a minimum of 100 meters away, 300 feet or more. And I would suggest to people, that in this sort of situation, get a trumpet playing friend and do some experiments. Get them to stand 100 meters away from you. You sit in the audience and have them stand in the middle of a football field and play the same piece of music on 5 different mouthpieces. What you will hear is that they always sound like themselves, and you may not be able to correctly identify which mouthpiece they used. In fact, you may find that you will intuitively select the wrong mouthpieces because just because of the way that we interact with instruments, and that they might instinctively put more physical effort into something. That's not something you're going to see, but you might hear it, and then you've got to ask yourself, if it's more physical effort, do I actually have the physical stamina to maintain that effort over time? Because sure, we can, for a lot of our lives, we can put physical effort into maintaining the ability to play. But I would sort of say, why bother? If you can learn to play efficiently and learn to play effectively with less physical effort, then that extra physical effort that's available to you is a bonus, and it's a free bonus. So anyway, hopefully I've managed to get my points across with this. Hopefully, this is a real, it was an attempt to explain a real situation that I, even after 10 years of playing with the TCE, have struggled with. And there's the fact that an acoustic instrument needs space for the sound to develop. And when you're sat in a certain space where that is not really possible, you don't really know how you sound. And so, to a degree, that would be an argument for putting a premium upon playing by feel. But it's also important not to get dragged down the path of choosing the wrong mouthpiece because you don't know what you sound like. I was fortunate that after doing this show, there was a trumpet player in the audience, and there was my wife in the audience, and both of them confirmed what I knew to be true, and that is that despite what I was hearing, and despite the struggle I was feeling as a result of not being able to hear my sound develop, they were hearing a clear, characteristic trumpet sound. And that's what we want. That should be our ultimate goal. So there we go. I will tie this one up here. I could easily sort of find another way to say the same thing, but there's probably not a lot of purpose. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you find this helpful. Maybe it will raise questions, and then we can get a dialogue going, or I can do a follow-up video. But for now, this is me signing off. Cheers.